Hi, everybody. I'm here with Haiku, my really beautiful, amazing colleague, and I'm Shivoso Phoenix, and we're doing a podcast that we call Relationship Medicine because we feel like there's not enough honest talk about what is going on in human relationships. And well, for me, the human relationship thing, we talk about intimate relationships, but it's fundamental to how we live in community. And there's a lot of people who want to live in community who also struggle in their intimate relationships. So we're going to do a series of podcasts where we just talk about different aspects of human relating and what's going on, and also want to really offer up some practical insights. I've been doing relationship guidance and coaching for almost 20 years, about 18 years. And so I think about this stuff a lot. And Haiku is brilliant at her insights into the aspects that come from her experience. And she's also an expert on women's cycles. I don't know, expert is a really good word, but she's a maven. She's an advocate and a reminder of what's really important. So, yeah, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Shivoso. My name is Haiku. My last name is Rebel, but Shivoso dubbed me my last name Rebel. And I think that kind of, I don't know, illustrates a lot about me. I am sitting here on my balcony in Albuquerque, New Mexico, um, in the high desert. This is where I call home now. And I'm in such an in-between phase. I feel like kind of reflective of the whole collective as well. Kind of difficult to describe what it is I do and who I am, but I'm obsessed with learning and I'm obsessed with acquiring different maps of cognition and consciousness to interpret this whole phenomenon that we're all collectively experiencing in this dimension. So I got really fascinated um, by my cyclical experience as a woman, and yoga led me to that I guess that innate experience, because yoga helped connect me with my body, and then that intelligence from my body immediately offered me insight into my cycle and my cyclical being. And I've started deep diving into that work through reading, through my own tracking, through my own kind of observations in an almost scientific way, but loosely poetic scientific way. And also it's opened me up to a whole community of women doing this work as well. Yeah, I have a lot of experience with relationships informed by, I don't know, a lifetime as a twin, identical twin, as well as I'm counting nine romantic relationships that were really big loves that like really dilated my heart and opened me up into, yeah, understandings of the dyadic relationship between men and women. And I also spent over a decade working with artists, performing musicians at a pretty high level. And I was always fascinated by what it took for multiple people to pull off some impossible things. Um, but yeah, I think everyone will get to know us throughout the duration of our podcast. And Shavos and I have these conversations regularly, and we just decided to record them to share with our friends and the public.
Yeah, it just seemed like we had some things to say. You know, today we were Haiku came up with this idea that we really needed to talk about how to term this, but I think she said, well, maybe you should say, but it was the liberation of the movement of the liberation of women away from relationships with men or something like that.
Well, the way that I'm seeing this right now, in as simple terms as I can come up with, there is this complete obvious dissolution or dissolving of these very like psychosomatic myths really connected to like Abrahamic religions, but like just like the myth of the one, or the myth of like the sky daddy God, or the myth of like really the myth of the one. And that is breaking down at a collective level, maybe in this, in terms of like Western Civ, the empire of Western Civ is collapsing, is one way to look at it, which the Western civilization is really the soil, or like the fodder that it grew from, really was like this kind of patriarchal like mythology around like the one God. And that you can get a lot more detailed and granular, obviously, if you go look into the scriptures and like what those myths and stories are actually like teaching us. But the way that kind of like they simply play out in our like personal and intimate lives, um, especially as a woman in Western civilization, seeing it as like seeking the one, like finding the one man, or finding salvation in the one husband that's going to come and like offer you safety and a home and resources and like economic security. All you have to do is pretty much like, castrate yourself as a woman, and then you're fine. Then but you found the one. And I see that myth breaking down, and I think we can discuss it at like a high level, kind of bird's eye, with like Western civilization as a whole, whether that's like in the West itself. I mean, the West has, through imperialism, has spread throughout the world, and now kind of exists less so in just like one geological location. It's less about that and more about like it existing in like our cellular memory, and like in our stories that play out in our everyday lives. Especially, it's especially obvious to me in our interpersonal relationships with our closest people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In my experience, I mean, obviously as a coach, I get people calling me up when things are not going well. And um, there is a lot of struggle and fragmentation in intimate relationships, between men and women, between men and men, between women and women. It doesn't really matter as much about the gender. The struggle is there in for two people to try to fit themselves into a traditional monogamous bond for the long term. I've found that, a lot of relationships are flaring up. People fall in love. I'm going to air quote, fall in love, um, because I think there's a huge misdefinition of what love is that people don't recognize or realize. Um, and they only last, somewhere between 6 months and, max out at like 3 to 5 years. And then people move on. And that creates a lot of fragmentation in communities because people move around a lot and there's no solid basis. So there's a lot of sort of consequences. And I'm not a committed advocate to traditional relationships. Let's not, go there. But there is something about the skill set that it takes to learn to live with one person and be a positive experience, a positive force, a to synergize together rather than have these two sort of separate lives, especially split along gender lines, men's and women, and they don't get each other. The whole the whole
I think
like
we should talk about terms though a little bit. I think
yeah, the
that like
semantics can be
just a
tricky.
little. We don't want to
Yeah.
talk too much about it because it's annoying. But I like, for me, I use the term woman and man. It's a map that, after all the maps I've explored, helps me explain what I'm wishing to convey easiest,
Hmm.
with of course understanding that like there are intersex people, and like they're like, it is, sex itself is a spectrum in a huge way. And I just don't think that like by changing the terms we're gonna, like we're getting to the root of the issues. And that's why like identity politics, or at least like what I hear when I hear identity politics, is really we're just arguing over semantics. And like that's just a lot of horizontal hostility, which is something that like oppressive forces like wish people to be doing, is like kind of divide and conquering. And like
Right.
if we're always fighting over terms like, why would you call that person a woman? They're not a woman, they're a person. And like I'm just like, okay, well, easier for me. It's just shorthand. That person has a vagina and a womb, and that womb bleeds and sometimes doesn't bleed, but definitely has a womb. Like I just shorthand that person, like a female body, a woman. That's easy for me. And plus, I also feel like there's something, and I've thought about this recently. It's like if we are going to exterminate the word woman, even if our intentions are very, quote unquote pure or like coming from a place of like queer ownership, which like I consider myself for a long time have queer in the sense of like I'm different. Like I am, and I don't conform to these boxes or categories that have been laid out for me socially. And like, well, and the point being is if I'm exterminating the word woman, I am, for whatever reasons they happen to be, I am aligning with the oppressor. Because like if we're exterminating a whole category of like women's studies, women's history, women's her story, like what we're doing is we are like consciously ignoring or putting a blind spot onto a a half of the world's population that has had a very significant, I mean, this is going to come up again and again in this podcast, like a very, very significant role in like what we're witnessing collectively today as like quote unquote an apocalypse, but like the unveiling of the patriarchy. And the patriarchy is another term that gets people a little revved up, but it's very simple. All the patriarchy is the material conditions created by men.
Right.
That's
Right.
it.
Yeah.
And it's nothing more than that. It's not an idea. It's not a theory. It's not something to be contested, really. It's just simply put, like, I mean, you can just go look at a microcosm of patriarchy, just go down the street to maybe a local business or like a local org and like see how that's organized. And of course, this isn't all the same, but a lot of times, more often than not, in the material conditions created by men, what you find is you'll have like a man, usually a white man, but sometimes not, but a man in some position of power, like organizing people or like organizing an economy around himself.
Right. Hierarchies, right? And how we've noticed how that does definitely has intrinsically in it oppression, right? Um, so yeah, we're going to dance around those things because we have to, right? And we are going to be talking about dyadic relationships. We'll often use terms men and women, but one thing I want to point out is like there's attraction, limerence and the romantic falling in love, but there's love. Like the actual concept of love does not have a category, does not notice categories. Love between children, love between anybody. So the skill, the actual prioritizing of love as a value, as an experience, and as a deliberate act doesn't really matter about the gender. But our experience for most people, admittedly, 99%, I don't know what the percentage is, but most people are doing these dyadic things between masculine and feminine bodied people, and that's
I
where a
mean, I'm
lot,
doing that with myself. Like I'm
yes,
doing that with myself constantly, like the balancing of the masculine and feminine.
right. And we have that's another thing we'll get into is, of course, the internal and the differentiation between masculine and feminine energies, and also, the man and woman inside of us. But we're like I said, this is a podcast that's going to roll a lot of different directions around this stuff, and we just start riffing on it. But really, I do notice there's a lot of resentment, struggle, fear, separation, and legitimate anger about the way that men and women particularly are relating to each other or treating each other or having the experience of being in intimate relationships. There's so many aspects to an intimate relationship that we'll try to, separate some of those out without getting too lost in the weeds. But my first distinction was between that falling in love, that attraction, and actual love. The agape, we only have one word for love. One of my pet peeves, we've got this one word that covers all of this different flavors, nuances, bits, ways of being with it. And, the Greeks had several, which was helpful. But eros, sexual attraction and desire and that sort of fire that pulls us together. right? And agape, which is more of universal, like, okay, you're sacred. And that's something I definitely want to like bring it into it is like, at what point does the relationship or the person or whatever become sacred? And then how do we treat the
Mm.
sacred? And where is the loss of the sacred in our whole culture? Like, what is sacred in our culture? You know,
I that's like my mind is the
I
wheels are
know.
turning, the wheels are turning. I mean, like I was like thinking about like, oh, let's have a conversation about like how polyamory is expressing itself right now, and then like some personal examples that we could cite. I'm like thinking specifically about some, relationships that have ended recently. But then I was also thinking, like I want to talk about the 4B movement, which has come onto my radar, and just this whole like, I mean, if women were encoded socially and physically to be like the child bearers,
Mm.
you know, if that, because I just learned recently the word wed actually had something to do with like herding cattle. So like, I mean,
Right,
and this is like a
right.
very real like historical facts that like women were treated legally by like the law like, that they were really meant to just be child bearers.
Yeah, breeding stock,
And if
um,
that's like the recent legacy that we are like the shadow that we are like coming up face to face with in real time, like of course our relationships, if the stories that generated our relationships, whether through like the legal sphere, the social sphere, the culture sphere, like all were like kind of coalescing to have the woman show up as a childbearer, whether you're in a homosexual relationship or you're in a heterosexual relationship or somewhere in between, like the story's the same. The legacy of the culture is the same in a way,
yeah, there's a
like
myth, like an underlying mythology, although it obviously rooted in biology that wouldn't necessarily be a reality in reality for the gay couples. But,
right, but
for
there's still tons of gay couples that want to have children,
yeah, absolutely, and there's always the person who takes on that, shares the nurturing role. Another
Well,
thing,
and then you can't talk about that without talking about surrogates too, which is like a whole conversation
a
in
whole
and of
conversation, but
itself.
I did want to also point out that I believe that there's a movement in the world toward balancing out those roles to a large degree, that there is a sharing of the nurturer archetype and the bearer archetype, the supporter,
Hmm.
we do divide on those biological lines because there's no way that I could, as a man-bodied person, know what it's like to have a body grow inside you and then push this thing out of your yoni that's, huge. And it's an incredible difference between the male and female experience. And
Well,
yet
yeah, I mean, there is some sacredness, like a woman being able
there's
to
some sacredness. Yeah.
dilate, and then like the veil between the unformed and the invisible and the visible. I mean, women are the original shamans, being able to commune with those invisible spaces, the spirit realm, so to speak, and then like come back into form after birth, after menstruation, and be like, oh, I survived to tell the
Right.
tale.
Transformation and initiation. And also the fact that the continuity through the egg womb dance goes all the way back to the origin of life. Basically, the first cells are there in this eternal thing through the sacred womb, right? And so there's another differentiation between the masculine and feminine. It doesn't diminish, and I want to make really clear, it does not diminish the masculine because we're all in this together. It takes two to make this work. And
If I, as a radical feminist who is in a current like liberation from the stories that have castrated me or like made me viscous to seeking monogamy, even in the state I'm in, which is like pretty much like 4B movement, like no sex, no marriage, no birth, like that's where I'm at like now. Even in my radical feminist state, I can sit here and say like I have such appreciation for the masculine. I love men despite everything, despite rape, despite
Right?
violence, despite abuse. Like here I am, like still like, yeah, I love men. Some men are my best friends. Like I'm still attracted to men. Like
Right? Right?
it's just the attraction itself is being recoded and
Yeah, yeah. The cultural story around it needs to change because it's breaking down as we said, Um, a lot of this comes down to, I mean, something you mentioned. Oh, I just wanted to ask you a question. What is 4B?
so
Can you explain that a
it's
little
a
bit?
so it's come in my radar this last week. I think it's being spread via TikTok, and I don't have a TikTok because I'm in my 30s. I don't know. People in their 30s have
No.
TikTok. I just don't have TikTok. But
Okay.
it is and it's a radical movement happening in South Korea, which you could argue is like a ground zero of patriarchal domination regime. Um, and the women there have decided to not have sex, not get married, not have relationship, no dating, and no birth. So sex, dating, birth, and marriage. No, those four things.
Do they
And
have
they've,
conditions that they're waiting, or they just decided, no, we're done.
oh,
We're
we're just
we're,
done.
we're
Yeah,
done. Yeah.
we're done.
Yeah,
Yep. And
that's
it's actually working. Like apparently there was like very few, if almost zero enrollment in like preschool.
right. Well, I wanted to know, working towards what other than the extinction of the human race or.
I think that like they're just at this moment like fed up with the abuse. They're
Yeah,
just fed it up. They're
right.
just like, we are fed up with it and we're gonna do what like within the purview of what I can do, which is like literally say no. I can say no.
We'll get to this because that's really important. I believe through my research that there's also evolutionary pressure that's causing that effect to happen.
For sure.
Birth rates are down across the world. I just saw that somebody said 40% less births in the United States right now. People are like, this is does not looking good. Why would I bring a kid into this world
Of course.
and
Well,
under these
civilization, there's
conditions? And so there's a
yeah,
multiple
exactly.
like cognitive or political reasons why that might be true. But I just wanted to clarify that 4Bs, it's like, yeah, that's like they're right there. Is like, okay, what is going on there from top to bottom? One is like you said, there's this fed upness with the bullshit and the abuse and the difficulty and it's just like, okay, that so should be done by now. It's interesting having grown up in the feminist 70s. I just assumed that this was all just going to go away, that we all figured it out, that, okay, we're all equal. Everybody gets it. Everybody's got their power. Everybody's got their place. We are doing it together. And there's no longer this top down, men are the center of the universe and what, king of his castle. All of that just seemed to it didn't seem real to me. I was like, well, of course, I was not that kind of guy. And I tried not to be that kind of guy. And yet it's still a pervasive um, reality around the world in many different cultures, not just the West.
Well, and that makes me think about like in feminism, we talk about the public sphere and the private sphere. And we also
Mhm.
talk about like I talk about the fourth wave, which is really like to me like the fourth wave has to be kind of like the grand finale wave, so to speak, where it's like, but it's like feminism can only like exist in patriarchy, right? It's like it
Right. It
doesn't
only because it has to have its opposite in order to
right.
define itself. Yeah.
And also like just because like, you know, Playboy or different magazines in the 70s, which were like, at the time I think there was a lot of like women's empowerment around like, oh, like being overly sexual is like a way to embody your like power. And then also like being equal in patriarchy does not make you a liberated woman. And
I see that still as a continuous thing with the body enhancement stuff, and everything airbrushed and AI enhanced so that it's like hyper stimulation of the visual component, the superficial components. And that just feeds to the masculine who's very visual, right? It's like, well, What about character? What about virtues? What
Mhm.
about courage and honesty and, loyalty? What about these other characteristics that humans in general could be embodying,
Oh my
rather
God,
than
how
just the
sexy is
superficial?
loyalty? Loyalty is so sexy. It's
Yeah,
the
but
sexiest.
it's also something you can't just like advertise. Oh, I'm a loyal person. You actually have
Right.
to enact it over time, right? Whereas
It's
superficial
nonverbal. It's
beauty,
a
you can look at and within seconds make an evaluation of whether that person's attractive, sexually attractive or not. And so there's been an emphasis on doing the low-hanging fruit of, body shaping and, cosmetics and clothing and selling that shit so hard, OnlyFans. It's like
I
there's
mean,
nothing,
energy doesn't lie, strength doesn't lie. Like the rituals and the practices and the values that an individual embodies do not lie. And at the same time, the receiver, perceiver has also been, culturally shaped to, receive certain things. Like when Shivoso looks at me at haiku can be a very different situation as when like my neighbor Tim looks at haiku. Like,
right?
right?
That narrow
I think,
focus, what am I trying, metrics of value, right? It's
yeah.
like what's important, what am I looking for, right? And I know a lot of men will overlook a lot of character flaws over a woman who
Mm.
matches their particular limbic ideal that is partly programmed into them, culturally inculcated, and partially just, the biology of like, oh, looking for a healthy, you know, mating partner, which it all comes down to that, back to that reproduction thing, that breeding thing, which is where we get tripped up because we don't differentiate between making a good breeding partner and a good partner, a person who is going to be an asset in the community, in your personal community, and it's a win-win rather than, oh, she's hot, right? And I'll just buy that. I just want to tap that shit. That whole thing, that whole uninitiated, unconscious male kind of thing is actually still reflected also in a lot of across the board cultural feminine reality.
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
it's like, oh, we're all sort of programmed to emphasize this superficial aspects. What I say is like low hanging fruit. It's kind of easy to change your brow line rather than your character.
Mm.
And so how do
Yeah, but
we
what we find is when we mutilate ourselves to try to reach a certain beauty standard, which the standard itself has been generated from some sort of dystopian reality, anyways, then you end
right,
up
right?
looking not only mutilated from like on multiple levels. I
Yeah,
mean,
distorted in order to reach some sort of hyper sexualized or hyper
when really what they're seeking is love. They're seeking intimacy.
right, right.
That's
Everybody
what
wants
we're
to
all
be like
seeking.
held as sacred and precious,
Yeah.
and it's like no matter how you hang what that would look like, it really comes down to is like I want to feel safe, I want to feel adored and special, and I want to belong to something. And it's like, oh well, that's human survival. It's like, man, we don't, we've atomized ourselves. Is the worship of the individual and our individual autonomy has we love our freedom. We really do love our privacy, our freedom. And if you isolate a human, they basically go insane. There's no checks and balances on their development. So the more time we spend alone and away from actual human beings that give us feedback, the more we can get into these like delusionary things, like just thinking, superficial beauty is the key.
Well, and you said the word atomize, which atom, and I like to think that it's because we've been atomized, ADAM,
Yeah,
like
right.
Adam and Eve, like that story that like women comes from the rib of Adam, and like Eve is evil, she
Yeah,
and
those
cursed.
desert monotheistic religions, have a lot of issues, but you see it also in um
Which, by the way,
Southeast
it was a
Asian cultures. as well. It's like, oh, well, we didn't, they didn't invent that stuff. Somehow it came out of
Mm.
some sort of, like you said, there was this sort of necessity. I've read this really interesting book called Ishmael, which proposed that when agriculture was developed and we stopped being nomadic hunter-gatherers, that's when suddenly having your um, partner, your wife, making sure that she was actually having your children genetically, so that when you passed on this inherited property, that it went to your particular family. It was kept so there wasn't allowed this outside.
Well, you're what you're hitting on is exactly what a lot of the radical feminists and matriarchal scholars I'm studying. Like that's, they say mama's baby, papa's maybe. And in pre-patriarchal conditions, which were we could I'm sure I will give more history on this as the podcast unfolds, but tens and tens and tens of thousands, if not 100,000 years of like just matriarchal conditions or matrifocal or matrilineal, whatever word feels easiest to digest. But it was woman, children centered plans and society. But
Yeah, it
yeah,
would have to be, because
yes,
without the reproduction, you got nothing. There's nothing to go hunting for and hunting and gathering for, if you're not having children. And there was also the genetic diversity that was necessary in order to have healthy, not inbred children.
but
You
what my point to finish my point, in patriarchy, you have to create the material conditions that would make a man know that was his kid.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you wouldn't know.
yeah, laws, walls,
Exactly.
keeping them sequestered, that all of that seemed to, and this is a proposal that seemed to make a lot of sense to me. It's not in your history books. Prehistory is pretty vague, but newer evidence is that we were not patriarchal or matriarchal. There was a beautiful dance
Egalitarian.
between the
Yeah.
masculine and feminine. We all had our roles, and we all had our natural proclivities that helped the whole thing work, right?
I mean, I would say that it's actually not so vague anymore. I mean, there's new archaeology and like a lot of scholars investigating pre-patriarchal conditions in our minds, like in our Western civ polished minds or manufactured minds, like we have been told like history starts really when patriarchy starts, which is around like 2000 BCE and like
Right.
in
When
classical
writing
Greek.
starts, when we start
Exactly.
recording
Yeah.
it. And so what happened before then? Oh, a lot of things happened before then,
In
like
fact,
a
there
million
wasn't. It
years.
was like when writing as we know it starts, like Miria Gamboutis, my favorite archaeologist, she gets into the meta language of the goddess where she's looking at symbols. Like it's actually a very advanced um pre-alphabetic. I wouldn't even want to call it pre-alphabet. It was like its own thing, it's like its own symbol system that was really indicative like the people's sacred relationship with nature.
Yeah, I would suspect it would started with art. It's like when we
Exactly.
express ourselves through art, that is a language that, eventually led to cuneiform and things like that. But I really, something just occurred to me. Let me see if I can get back to it. It's that what we need to do is we actually need to reinvent relationship. The fact that it's breaking down after, 4,000 years or 10,000 years, however long you want to call it. There's a there's a rethinking of what is important. How do we do this? And I think we're in a really chaotic and
Hmm.
scary place. It's like birth rates down. In some ways, that's great. That's
Hmm.
fantastic because the earth has got plenty of people.
Hmm.
And at the same time, it's like, okay, well, that's going to lead to a certain amount of suffering and a sort of pruning back that people are not going to volunteer for. Inevitably, what happens is there's less young people, healthy, working, producing people to support all of the older, not producing,
Hmm. And
and
the children.
and there's less children, which deeply undermines the meaning of life. Like one thing
Mm.
about having children, having grandchildren, I've noticed is that we're wired to feel a deep, deep cosmic spiritual fulfillment to actually having that experience. There's a woman having a child goes through an initiation into motherhood that goes on for years, right? And of course, the husband, male, also goes through, but not as dramatically as the physiological and mental changes that happen when you have a baby. And I've been privileged to have four kids, and I've been there for a lot of single women who are having children, and and just seeing how it goes, for them. It's like they're different people on the other side of that. And if we eliminate that, not only will we, risk kind of dying out as a species, we'll also lose something that really connects us to the ineffable eternity. There's something
Absolutely.
about that natural
It's
function.
mothering. I mean, you're talking about mothering,
Yeah, yeah,
matter comes
mattering.
from
And
the
it's
word
it's a universal thing.
matter.
It's not
Yeah.
just a woman, a human thing. It's like, oh yeah, matter. It's all this stuff. And we, moving
Hmm.
into the metaphysics, it's like that's what it is. It's the earth plane. It's everything. And I heard this really interesting quote, and I kind of kept it, is that the feminine, not women, but the feminine is everything.
Mm.
It's all matter. It's all reality.
Hmm.
It's all creation, right? But the masculine is nothing in the sense of like the surrounding empty void,
Mm.
the Shiva void, the vertical that surrounds everything and gives it that place. You'll see behind
Hmm.
me the Sri Yantra. This is exactly what this is. There's a bindi where the masculine, the upright triangle, and the feminine, the downward triangle, meet and then explode into reality, right?
Mm.
So it takes both, right? But there's
Mm.
this acceptance of the mud and the guts and the blood and the feeling and the death and the life and the birth that is essentially feminine.
Hmm.
It's the mystery of everything. And this is really my thesis, is that we need to bring the sacred back into relationship. No longer superficial, need-based, I want this, ego, like feed me, fill me, help me feel safe, help me feel, real, all of that. It's like, oh, but there's a transcendental element to this that you don't take it lightly. There's
Hmm.
no light relationship.
Hmm.
There's no casual,
Hmm.
truly casual sex. That doesn't mean there's not playful lovemaking,
Hmm.
but it's not, this is just, it doesn't count. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't
Mm.
matter,
Mm.
right?
Yes. Ah, Shivoso. I could not agree with you more. And
Yeah.
like,
And that's
even though
where
we had different paths of getting there, I agree with your thesis. I
yeah,
agree.
I think that's where we're failing in our education of children. I'm not talking about the education system, which is incredibly oppressive and patriarchal, and it despite the good things about it, it's actually starting to like implode our culture. But there's another way, and there's another part of my thesis, which is that we need elders. We actually need elders who've been through this cycle of attraction and love and children multiple times to say, this is what's important. This is how you do this in order to make it so everybody comes out better. So that the children who are going to inherit our legacy, whatever that is, positive or negative, have the most holistic, healthy way of being, because they're going to
Of
need that in order to get through the mess we're making.
course, of
you
course.
know
Absolutely.
yeah, that's my rave, is like we need to figure out how to make relationship sacred again and stop selling it as a masturbatory, self-oriented, selfish narcissistic experience.
When I was leaving one of my very abusive partners, it took me a few months to really like get the, you know, uh, what is it, fire or like just courage to just like pack the car and go.
Mm,
And one of my counselors posed a really interesting question. Like, why do women, instead of asking the question, why do women stay? We need to ask like, what are the barriers to leaving?
mhm,
And that makes me think like, yeah, what are those barriers? Because you had mentioned like, okay, like instead of relationships being like, oh, I'm out of desperation, out of scarcity, out of like just um limbic pleasure seeking, out of like whatever it is, like that, like I almost feel like those are related almost. It's almost like we've been search like our um prism or fulcrum that we're searching relationships for has been corrupted, the heart literally broken, which is like corruption, like leading to more heartbreak. And there's also like the barriers to leaving are the same like reasons for entering almost.
right? That is so true. There's legit basic fundamental reasons why there's good in everything, and there's a reason why we're doing it, because obviously relationships like so difficult, and anybody who's been in a relationship realizes, oh, it can take as much as it gives. And any logical person would never choose to have children because, man, your quality of life goes way down, but your quality of spirit and wholeness goes way up. And so if you don't value that wholeness, right? But yeah, the reasons we get into relationships are very important. There's nothing wrong with seeking safety. There's
True.
nothing wrong with seeking support. We grow up in a
Absolutely.
nuclear family model that leaves us hungry for that feeling of I belong, I'm held, I'm safe. There's numbers. An individual human all by themselves in nature naturally is dead. They do not survive. We are a collective clan type creature. And so when we don't have a clan and we've got that clan down to one person, back to that, oh, the one, it's like, well, of course it's desperate. It's desperate. We have to have somebody. We can't feel limbically safe and whole until we have at least one. And of course, one isn't enough. It's like,
Correct.
how's
When you
that
have
person
to
going to
put the
fulfill all those
pressure,
needs,
yeah,
right?
you put the pressure of one or two people to fulfill what a whole village would do, it's going to end in disaster.
Yeah, we're just wired to be more clan village, and we've in the
Absolutely.
for the sake of freedom, liberty, individuality, um, doing anything we wanted, we've fragmented all of that. We've gone a little too far, and we're starting to pay the price of it.
Well, and the clan, I mean, this is exactly like one of my like our main arteries in this work is like how do we reignite Renaissance the clan? That's
Yes.
I mean, it's part of why I loved touring was because like when I would go on tour with bands, bands are a clan. They are that's what they are. And like we can talk, I mean, there are other things too. A lot of times there's and I talking about narcissism, I think that's a whole I think we can dedicate a whole podcast to
Yeah,
narcissism
we'll get
because
to that, but I want
well,
you to
because there's
expand on
such
this theme of the
yes.
clan.
Well, a it's like we're not reinventing the wheel here. We can literally, with like the newest findings in archaeology, specifically in like feminist scholarship, like look at like how clans were very successful for tens and tens of thousands of years. I mean, and how they were organized. I wish I could just riff off the cuff, like exactly how they were organized. I'm still in the process of learning that, but essentially, like you have a mother who's pretty like this like central to the clan and all her children and her brothers and her sisters were part of this clan. So when
Mhm.
a and falling in love of course happened, but when like let's say a daughter of the clan fell in love with a man from another clan, when and if that ever broke up, they broke up, she would just go back to her mother clan. There was no like you know
There was no abandonment.
what's yeah, there was no
Yeah.
abandonment, and there was always security,
Yeah, if any children came of issue of that, they were taken in by the clan. It was like, great, you're not going to starve, you're not going to die. Um, yeah, I think we actually reproduce this all the time, and
Hmm.
recognize how wonderful it is, especially like if you've ever
In
done
festival, like in festival settings.
festivals or you've worked on a team
Yep.
doing one thing, movie production, anything
Yep.
where you work together for a common purpose
Oh,
over
that's my favorite
a period
thing.
of time. There's a warmth, there's a heating up of this
Mm.
feeling of like purpose and belonging and safety and joy. And, even if it's grindy hard work. And it all
Especially
depends on
when it's
the
grindy hard work. That's like it's
yeah,
sometimes
it's
even
like
like
the more dangerous it is in a way, the more risky it is, or the more necessary it is, the more that happens. And we also know that it doesn't take but one or two people to kind of break that, to the ones who like insist on the hierarchical. If you've ever worked in a restaurant, you realize this could be so much fun, and yet they make it as shitty as possible. You got an asshole manager, and everybody's top down all the way down to the dishwasher is at the bottom of the pecking order,
well,
and
simply
it's miserable.
transaction cannot and will not and has not and simply does not form the glue, the adhesion for a
Right?
relationship.
Yeah,
I
you
mean, like,
can't use money to glue people together.
and when you start out in capitalism and like late stage patriarchal capitalism, what we see is like the results of what happens when we outsource everything to transaction. I think Charles Eisenstein speaks about this brilliantly in his book, Sacred Economics, which is
Yes,
a hefty book, but like he talks a lot about like when things are just transaction, childcare, education, food, everything just becomes this kind of like sterilized transaction and like nothing is left sacred anymore.
right. We've made money sacred, and it has no heart. And so it doesn't create loyalty bonds. You can't buy love.
People
But
are catching on to this. They have, I feel it.
I
I
think
mean,
that's
I
the
can
movement
sense
away
it.
from work that we have
Yeah.
is, and
Hmm.
also, getting back to the frustration with relationship,
Well,
because
I would
a lot of our
differentiate between
relationships
jobs and
are,
work.
they are transactional. They're like, I'll do this for you, you do this for me. Oh, you got a lot of money or you've got a lot of beauty. Oh, great. I want that asset. So I'm going to buy that asset. I'm going to buy that ass, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I literally was just listening to a podcast, one of my favorite podcasts, Subject to Power. And it's a radical feminist podcast, and they're interviewing a Australian woman who was in the sex industry forever, and like she's talking very specifically about her lifetime of what happens when sex is bought and sold. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, and that is also I mean, there's a lot there is a this is a controversial subject because a lot of people right now are in the camp of like sex work is liberating for women. I disagree with that. I think I really do. I mean, I think maybe momentarily it can feel economically liberating, maybe momentarily, but I think over time when sex becomes something that is so, and you know a lot about this too, coming from the tantric world, like when sex is bought and sold, you are literally like not only creating these power differentials that can become abusive and usually do and lead to trauma, but then also like you're taking the sacredness out of it completely.
Right. Yeah. This is definitely an interesting paradox, because on one level it is liberating and it is empowering, right up, like you said, to this very limited degree, from such a low level of oppression. Like, women
Right.
are single moms, or going to college, they're broke, they're offered these jobs as that pay minimum wage or low wage, and then they're offered being a stripper, and they're suddenly is like, oh, I made $800 in 3 hours.
To be
And
liberated in patriarchy is not true liberation,
yeah,
in
it's
my
not true
opinion.
liberation. It's the superficial carrot of liberation.
Right.
And it does work. I mean, people do work their way through college doing this. I have many women friends who offer this as a healing modality and sell it, right? But
Hmm.
it also takes the soul out of it. It's like you can't stay there, because I've also seen that eventually it leads to contempt of men. They're so
Hmm.
pathetically easily, duped into giving away tons of resources for this like shallow momentary experience. How could you respect anybody who's just such a doofus to do that? You
Well,
know,
in this, exactly. I
I mean,
mean,
it's just a perception thing. I'm not saying that's the actuality. Be it's something we have to get away from, the economic model of relationship and sexuality.
mhm.
And that's
I mean,
taking.
transaction as a whole, I think it needs to be is being reassessed. Like, there's a difference between work and jobs. I love working. I
Yeah,
hate jobs, right?
yeah,
Like,
right, yeah.
I hate selling my body. Speaking of prostitution, regardless if it's sex or not, like I hate selling my
Like standing
body
on my feet all
to,
day washing dishes,
right,
you know,
is a
is
form of prostitution. You could
it's like
argue
I just gave away my life force for money, and it was like
for
a very
$15 an
minimal
hour.
amount of money that would only keep me in exactly the same economic conditions forever. It's like, no, this is not lifting me out of
No,
and so there's that. Does something like sex work actually lift women out of poverty? Many times it can. It can. But at the same time, the cost
but
in
that's not what's going to
relational,
liberate us from poverty. The
right?
point is that if poverty is the issue,
Poverty and actually capitalism's the issue.
right? Exactly,
It's
creating
the
the poverty.
fragmentation, it's the bringing everything down to the metric of money and how we look at relationship as kind of a shopping adventure of like,
Yes.
well, I can trade it in for a new model. I can maybe I should pass this one up and get the next one because this is better. And the whole idea of having no objective way of evaluating whether a person should be in your life or not, it's like who can do that? We the romantic model has led us into this trap of going for the superficial because we don't know this person. We're just
Mm,
going to go for what they look like and what they act like on the surface. And how many times do we get 6 months, 2 years into a relationship and realize this person is an asshole. They
mm,
really don't care about me, or they really have no skills at doing this relationship thing, or they're not really good husbands, fathers, partners. They're just all about themselves. They're lazy. They don't understand. It's like a
mm,
lot of all the complaints come out of this, like, well, I thought you were. My
mm,
projection of you was enough to trip me into the love sort of program chemical thing. And then all of a sudden I'm stuck with you for a period of time and then I'm out. And we get this series of broken hearts and disappointments and bitterness. And, it's like, oh shit, that's what we want is relationships that last for our lifetime in whatever way they, what is right relation, right? Rather than breaking up with your lover, you readjust the relationship until it's in right relation. Maybe we're supposed to be business partners. Maybe we're supposed to be friends. Maybe you're my brother and you're not my lover. But boy,
mm.
we get sucked right into that, like, oh, let's do that. Let's do that wild thing because I need it so bad. I'm so hyper stimulated and hyper hungry, from both genders. So it's a it's a trap. And it has a lot to do with our education and the way we example relationship to the young, to
And
ourselves.
also, and trauma. It comes from, I think, a lot of trauma
Yeah,
too.
well, the
I was just
trauma
thinking
falls
this
from,
morning,
it's like, is that chicken and egg? Because
right?
the trauma has been going on for centuries.
Yeah.
And, it's like,
Oh, it's inherited trauma.
it's
And
gotten
I
so
think
bad that we're all chemically enhancing ourselves in order to make it,
exactly.
not all, obviously we're talking in generalities. There's always exceptions to all of these things, but still it's a scary situation to be in the dating game or the hoping for a relationship that lasts kind of position and seeing what's out there, what goes on. It's hard not to get angry, bitter, and say, "Four
And
B's, baby, I'm out."
yeah, exactly. Well, and meme culture is so interesting. I mean, the internet itself has kind of broken the membrane between the private and public sphere, which in a lot of ways has kind of, I think, bolstered the feminist movement because the private sphere was where the rape and abuse and oppression was happening. And I think now that that membrane is being unveiled, so to speak, like I think that there is it's not an accident we're seeing this huge fourth wave of feminism come in such boldness. I also think too that like meme culture I've noticed is just like so on top of this like sexual romantic space. Like it's like whenever I'm going through a breakup recently, one of the many, when I'm going through a breakup and I just like open Instagram, like I see this like echo chamber of all of these memes that are like sometimes like actually very helpful because it's like, oh wait, I'm not alone in this experience. Like other women or beings are going through the same exact thing, like literally to a degree that it's starting to get like AI intelligence specific. Like what I was just going through with this last one, he, to a like almost verbatim, I'm reading memes that are just like exactly what I experienced, which was in the realms of like emotional torture.
Right,
But
right,
like, you know, and really just like it's like specifically giving like directions almost of like if this person is not showing up in X, Y, and Z ways, you need to let them go. They're just wreaking havoc on your nervous system. And it's like, yeah, they're that meme is like not wrong. I also wonder what the results of this like very instantaneous meme culture, which is really a meme, a cultural meme is just like, and I, informative gene almost that just like propelling culture in like different directions
right.
and
It may
growth.
be actually driving its own existence, right?
Exactly.
As we AI or even just doing any kind of art that repeats that experience, it's very limbically, you know, engaging, and so it does sell things. Everybody has that experience, but then we validate and create more of that experience because rather than moving away from it, we're like, oh, we're reinforcing it. We could put the expectation that that's what we're gonna experience, and yeah, it's kind of a death spiral. It's
It is. It
a
totally
self
is.
a self-reinforcing activity. And so AI is just accelerating that. Yes, it is comforting to know that other people are going through this. You're not the only one, you're not crazy, but what popped into my head was the definition of crazy, that, meme, another meme is doing the same behavior and expecting a different
Expecting
result.
different results.
So it's kind of like, oh, we're always doing the same kind of relating actions and getting the results we don't want, but we just go back and do it again, right?
Well, in some ways, what I'm noticing, Shivoso, and I would like to do a whole conclusion of our conversation because there's been gems that we've kind of excavated, and I want to like just like recap them.
Yeah,
But like
yeah,
what I've noticed, like this idea of like the one, we've kind of just like memed our way into just isolation and oneness, or atomized our way, and just mythed our way or memed our way into just like one. And like in some ways cyclically, and I haven't talked about the cycle as much, but like to me, I find this to be a cycle. It's like I think about the new moon, it's the beginning and it's the end. So
right.
yes, it might be the end of like how we've been relating to each other in a lot of ways as we're seeing the end of really like patriarchal civilization, which must be like must end. It must end. It's
It's
not working.
non-survival. It's a
It
non-survival thing.
yes.
It's, self-extincting.
It's an end game, but it's
Yeah,
so it is also the beginning. And this is part of our intention with relationship medicine is like, how are we going to literally create the stories, them generate the memes, have the conversations, create the clans again from one to
definitely want to
some.
get into that.
Yeah.
We're just about at an hour, but I really want anybody who's listened to this whole thing to please comment and ask, any of the gems that popped out. We'd like to pursue them deeper because the way Haiku and I work is we just start, as you see, we just start bouncing off each other and things pop up to the surface that are more brilliant than other things, right? And it's like, oh, that's what we want to pursue because reclanning, it just like, wow, there's this whole conversation about how,
Reclanning, remattering,
yeah,
those are
remattering,
things.
how the actual social media uh, like arena actually is reconnecting us to it's like the private sphere is disappearing. And what happened in the clan was there was no privacy. You didn't go off into the forest and go do crazy shit because not only would you just get eaten by whatever was out there in the forest, so you'd stick with everybody and everybody watched you doing what you were doing. So rape wasn't that often a real thing unless you were trying to do it with another clan. You're outside of
Yeah.
where you're being observed. Child abuse,
It's
all of just being an asshole. People would
well,
call you out because they're looking right at you, going, "What the fuck are you doing?"
your
Not
mother goddess would call
right,
you out. And this is where
right,
like, oh God is watching. It's like mother is watching. Like
right. And the
what your
representative,
character I want to say too, because we talked about this earlier and we need to, I think, dedicate probably a whole podcast to this, but we talked about like the attraction to values like loyalty, like really breaking down those principles and values like loyalty, courage, integrity, like what that really looked like, those traits, but it's like that's basically how you behave when Mother Goddess is watching you, when your
Right.
mother is
Somebody's
watching you.
watching and that changes our behavior. You know, that's a whole nother thing. I really love this conversation. I think what we'll do is we will listen to it again ourselves, of course, and we're going to pull out some of those things. But anybody who's really listening to this relationship medicine, please comment. Please send us some questions you'd like to ask or follow up with your own genius because we don't know everything. And we're not right about everything, but we want to start this conversation because it's absolutely necessary. We need to be talking about these difficult things and fucking it up, getting in there and messing around with it, and you know, getting that. We need the clans to get together and say, what's the right way to do this? How do we do this? So yeah, I want to get into the well, what's the alternative? You know, it's like pointing out the problem is easy in a way, but pointing out the solution. And we've touched on
And
that too.
we'd have, and I think growing roots with someone like that's what I'm discovering in this moment in my life. Um, a woman that I'm like now transitioning really into my quote unquote mothering, mattering years, even though
Mhm.
I don't have my own children. And that's like a big, point of like indecision for me, to be honest. But it's like if I had my clan, I'm sure I'd love to have children. I don't have my clan, so I'm like, no, that's a hard no. But um, I'm thinking like, yeah, remattering is like really big in my like sphere right now. Like, how can I get back into the matter of things? And growing roots with people. I really people who have had like friendships, relationships with for 3 to 10 years. It's like that is such an sacred and valuable, beautiful phenomenon gift that like I'm just finding more and more like purpose in and more potency. It's just such a gift to have that.
That is so beautiful. I really love that remattering because I just thought about like, oh, I'm so about bringing the sacred back in, you know, the vertical, like look, let's look up and look down to the sacred, and you're like remattering, and they go together, right? That's
Mm.
the whole thing, you know, masculine and feminine. So here we go.
Which is interesting because in patriarchy we have subscribed the material universe to be that of a man's world. Men built this,
Right.
when really it's like
Oh, I know
that it
this.
might be the patriarchal reversal that like
That's the gaslighting at the root of everything, right?
well, and I was also thinking about how like love itself, that word has also been there's been some reverses in that too,
Yeah, yeah,
you
we
know.
definitely could spend a whole hour talking about what love is and isn't, you know. I'd love to do that. So yeah, we don't want to go on beyond an hour. We love you, anybody who's like given us a few minutes of your time. We're going to do this more frequently, so you'll see more of us, and we'll let you know what formats we'll put this out on. But you know, this is Haiku and Shivoso just going off on what's important to us. We do this all the time, and so
Yeah.
thank you for sharing it with us and sharing
Yeah.
this time with us. I could go on and on and on.
I know. Thank you, Shivoso. Thank you so much for anyone who's listened to this far. Like, wow.
Yeah,
Yes.
wow, you're awesome. You must be
Yeah.
one of our friends because this is the
Yeah.
first one. This is number
Exactly.
one, relationship medicine number one. Um, and we'll post it out there and we'll let you know when more are coming. This is great.
Right.
All right.
Ciao for now.
Ciao for now.